Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I apologize that we have to start a little bit late. It turns out to be the case that we had an issue with the Zoom setting, but now we are back to business. Heartfelt welcome here from Montreal, Concordia University. We are greeting you from the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies and the Department of Political Science. My name is Csaba Nikolényi. I teach political science and Israeli politics here at the department, and I also serve as the director of the Azrieli Institute. It is my pleasure, truly a privilege, to welcome a dear friend and colleague, Dr. Shlomi Balaban, who is joining us from Sapir Academic College in Israel, but currently he's spending a very important research fellowship as a visiting scholar at the Faculty of Law of the University of Ottawa. Shlomi graciously accepted our invitation to spend a couple of days with us here in Montreal to discuss some important issues from his research, which has already received accolades and very important attention in Israel. I'm delighted to mention and bring it to your attention that Shlomi's PhD dissertation, which was completed last year, about a little bit more than a year ago, received already two very prestigious prizes. A prize for outstanding dissertation that was awarded by the Israeli Political Science Association, and the Best Dissertation Award that was given to Shlomi by the Association for Israel Studies, the single largest academic federation that brings together scholars, faculty, as well as graduate students who work on various issues related to the study of Israel. Dr. Balaban is a graduate from the University of Haifa, spent many years working in the Knesset, and his dissertation work in particular zeroed in on the formative first decade of the long process and important process through and by which many of the procedures of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, the engine and the heart of Israeli democracy, as I like to talk about it, were institutionalized. So today, Shlomi is going to tell us, give us a little teaser about one particular chapter from that deep study and thorough study on the institutionalization of the Knesset, by looking specifically at the unknown ethics mechanism of the Israeli parliament. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I would like to give the floor and the screen to my friend and colleague, Dr. Shlomi Balaban. Shlomi.
Thank you, Csaba. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Csaba, for your hospitality and friendship. Thank you, Cor. Thank you all attending via Zoom. As Csaba mentioned, my dissertation dealt with the formative years of the Knesset, the first decade of the Knesset, and I reviewed several aspects of it. I dealt with the parliamentary immunity, with the work conditions, meaning salary and pensions, and with the ethics. And today we'll talk about as Csaba said, the unknown ethics mechanism of the Knesset. So let us begin. So my agenda for today is to talk about ethics, to talk about gradual development or evolvement of ethics, on the correlation or the link between ethics and parliamentary immunity, and how did the mechanism of ethics mechanism was institutionalized during the first decade. Now, the existing literature talks about the ethics committee that was founded at the beginning of the 1980s of the 20th century. I wish to argue that the ethics mechanism existed from 1949, actually, and I will show you all kinds of evidence for that. Also, I want to argue that once the mechanism was institutionalized, there was a connection between that and the parliamentary immunity law. Behind me, you see Frumin House. Ever been to Frumin House?
No. What's it called? Frumin?
Yeah.
Yes.
King George Street in Jerusalem.
The museum.
Soon, probably. I mean, we've been waiting for years. This is where the Israeli parliament sat between 1950 to 1966. And today's discussion is maybe part of a wider discussion on the question of how do you establish a parliament when you don't have a parliamentary tradition at all. So one of the topics, issues that exist in each and every parliament is the question of ethics. What do I mean by ethics? I don't mean ethics in the current sense of whether a member of the Knesset or politician received gifts or got plane tickets or all kinds of gifts. I mean ethics in the most original sense of proper conduct between colleagues, proper conduct between members of the Knesset, proper conduct between members of the Knesset and the Speaker of the Knesset. That is the most basic understanding of ethics. Okay. Now, you can see Frumin House behind me. Frumin House is right on the street of King George Street. And following a talk that we had yesterday, I thought it would be interesting to explain or maybe show you about the proximity of Frumin House to the street and the proximity within Frumin House, the proximity between the members of the Knesset. So, Corey, what do you do now? I minimize. I minimized. Click it. Okay. Don't play the music, right? Good. Just a few more seconds.
אני מזמין את אהרון גולדשטיין לעלות על הדוכן. אהרון גולדשטיין, אני אקרא לפניך את נוסח ההצהרה, ואתה תשיב מתחייב אני. זה נוסח ההצהרה. אני מתחייב לשמור אמונים למדינת ישראל ולמלא באמונה את שליחותי בכנסת. אני מברך אותך בכניסה לכנסת, ואני בטוח שתרומתך תהיה. תודה למזכיר הכנסת. יום עבודה פרלמנטרית חדש.
התבדר. אוקיי. Now, one moment to get PowerPoint back. Okay. We good? Okay. So, the question of ethics was first risen by Israel Bar Yehuda of Mapam on the 6th of July, 1949. It was done during a session of the Immunity Committee. And the idea that was talked about was to adapt a court of honor in the parliament, in the same way that existed in the Zionist Congress, by the way. In the Zionist Congress, the role of the Court of Honor was to settle disputes between members of the Congress. And of course, since many of members of the Knesset were formerly, or actually at that time also members of the Zionist Congress, they were familiar with that activity. Now, there were a few disputes already in 1949 and in 1950, especially complaints by members of the Communist Party or against members of the Communist Party. But that did not actually evolve into anything, although it happened. The Knesset preferred to take its time with the complaints and not to discuss them. So the second phase actually began in June 1951. This is Hillel Cook. At that time was a member of Cherut, Peter Bergson. What happened during that incident is that Speaker Sprinzak wanted to vote on a certain law, certain bill, and refused to grant Cook the floor, despite Cook's protests. Cook continued to discuss the matter, or should I say even yell, and Sprinzak called him to order. And in retaliation, Cook told Sprinzak, "I'm calling you to order." And then Sprinzak said, "Okay, you're going to the House Committee." So what happened this time, again, this is the second phase. The House Committee initiated a subcommittee to deal with that incident. The subcommittee was made of 3 members of the Knesset. And it appears that the subcommittee decided that Cook should be reprimanded for his behavior. Other than that is the first time there was an actual sanction. It is also a de facto recognition of the Knesset House Committee authority to deal with ethics. Now, the third phase is relates to the Luxembourg agreements, other known as Schema Shilumim, or repatriations agreement between Israel and the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. The actual agreement was signed on September 10th, 1952. And according to the agreement, Germany had to compensate Israel and Jewish refugees, and also to establish the Conference on Jewish Material Claims against Germany. Now, that was a pivotal moment in the history of Israel, in the history of Israeli democracy, and also in the Israeli parliament days. The debate was on the Knesset on the 7th of January, 1952. Now, there was a lot of tension in the air. There was sure to be violence. There were many blockades. There were thousands of people protesting against the agreement. And the main protest was in Kikar Zion Square. And the man that you see here is the younger version of Menachem Begin, with the mustache, and taking a stand against the protest. Now, we saw Bert Fuhrman before. Now I want you to understand how close is Zion Square to the Knesset. It's only a matter of really few hundred meters. So once the protesters decided to begin walking towards the Knesset, they actually stormed it. Hundreds of people were arrested. There was tear gas, 200 protesters and 140 policemen were injured. One of the Knesset members, Hanan Rubin from Apam, was also injured. And there was true chaos. Now, what happened inside the Knesset was discussed in the past in relation to Menachem Begin. It is a well-known fact for Israeli historians and legal historians that Menachem Begin was the first man to be suspended from the Knesset. That happened on that day after a speech that he made, and the speaker asked him to stop speaking, and he said, "If I won't speak, nobody will speak." And again, chaos began. The House Committee decided to suspend Menachem Begin, and he was suspended for a few months. What is less known is another incident, which actually takes us to another phase. So when you look on those two ladies, Ada Maimon and Esther Raziel, now everything looks fine. They look like really nice, cool, regular ladies. Ada Maimon is sipping a cup of tea here, whatever. What happened on the plenum is that Ada Maimon attacked Esther Raziel Naor and tried to choke her while cursing her in the most hideous names. Let's stay polite. And the House Committee, again, decided to establish a subcommittee, like in Cook's instance, for example, but it developed the scheme. And what happened now is that there was a defendant and there was a plaintiff. So Maimon was said to raise her hand on Raziel Naor, but the subcommittee was not sure if she actually grabbed her by the neck. So Ada Maimon was also received a reprimand. The thing is that the title of this subcommittee was clarification. Clarification, berur. Now, clarification is what was that was the way to settle disputes in kibbutzim, in a smaller company of people. The subcommittee, as I said before, while the Knesset had the chance, they tried not to deal with these kind of incidents. But because that was actual violence, and because there were reporters there, and because it was in the newspapers, they had no choice. So this is the most important point in the, let's call it institutionalization, or the basic institutionalization of the ethics mechanism, because from now on until the end of the 60s, the modus operandi of the House Committee or the ethics mechanism was clarification, a subcommittee of 3 that dealt with this kind of incidents. Okay, so this is from newspapers in Hebrew about the condemnation to Ada Maimon and blaspheming the Knesset and those responsible for it, and so on. Okay, so we've established that there was an ethics mechanism, and that exact ethics mechanism operated from that point on till the end of the 60s. So the question is, what it's got to do with parliamentary immunity? So a few words about the parliamentary immunity law. The parliamentary immunity law passed only in 1951 against Ben-Gurion's will. Ben-Gurion was against parliamentary immunity. He came from a really egalitarian point of view about the privileges that members of Knesset should have. By the way, Adam and Mon shared the same sentiment. But once it passed, I will show you that it really had a significant in terms of the institutionalization or development of the ethics mechanism. And why is that? I argue that because of that, the coalition understood that it will be really hard to lift parliamentary immunity. The ethics mechanism in many incidents became sort of a whip to control the opposition, and especially the Communist Party. And many times, out of the incidents that I'll briefly mention a few of them, Mapai and Cherut worked together against the communists. And at the same time, it should be mentioned that the ethics mechanism was also addressed by members of the opposition, because that was their only option. So on the 2nd of July 1952, there was an incident that led to mutual complaints between David Ben-Gurion and Tawfik Toubi. Tawfik Toubi, prominent member of the Communist Party, gave a speech in which he talked about the IDF going into Arab villages and so on. That incited the members of the Knesset, and Ben-Gurion began to shout at him, get off the podium, and ask the speaker to close his microphone, turn it off. At the end of it, the House Committee decided to sanction Tawfik Toubi and to suspend him from 2 sessions of the Knesset. Now, that was the 2nd of July, 1952. What probably happened is that on the same day, Ben-Gurion, or someone from his office, wrote to the Attorney General, Chaim Cohen, and asked him, is it possible to lift Tawfik Toubi immunity because of the things he said in the Knesset? Now, why do I think that a letter existed or was written? Because I found Chaim Cohen's response. So, as you can see, can I show it? This is from the 3rd of July, 1952, just the day after. And Chaim Cohen gave the most, an answer that you would expect from a jurist, talking about the law, all the provisions and so on, and explaining to Ben-Gurion and his men that what Toubi did was part of his freedom of expression as a member of the parliament. So my conclusion is, therefore, that the immunity of member of the Knesset, Tawfik Toubi, cannot be lifted and there is no judicial provision to punish him or to sanction him. I think that was like the most important thing at the involvement of the ethics mechanism as a way to whip the opposition, because I'm going to show you a few other incidents that it seems to me to be, it looks like it's clear that they were derived from that letter. Now, I'm going to talk about just 5 incidents. I'm going to run it down, but one of the most interesting things is, again, most of the complaints are against members of the Communist Party, and especially can be can cancel the laser. Okay, now it's against Esther Vilenska of the communists, most of them. So on the 13th of June, 1953, this is the Ben Gurion Tubi incident. This is the Vilenska Shlomo Lavi incident. She was a member of the Communist Party, is a member of Mapai, Ben Gurion's party, an old friend of Ben Gurion, actually. And she complained about the fact that he called her a black Nazi. That went to the ethics mechanism, and the ethics mechanism replied, it's not the ethics mechanism, it was the House Committee. The chairman of the House Committee, a member of Mapai, said that it was not in the protocol, therefore she has no case. March 29th of March 1954, Vilenska complained against Yohanan Bader of Cherut, Menachem Begin's party, because he turned off her microphone while she was speaking. Again, they told her there's nothing in the protocol. You have no ground. Now, this is really interesting. This is the 5th of April, 1954. There was a clarification for Esther Vilenska, Tawfik Tubi, and Moshe Sneh. At that time, he was not in the Communist Party, it was quite close to that. That was on the 5th of April, 1954. On the 24th of March, 1954, there was a terror attack in Malea Krabim, in which 11 people were murdered in a bus. And the member of the Communist Party and the Left Party talked about that in the Knesset. And the response was of the House Committee that I'm going to try to look at the exact wording, that the accusation against the State of Israel, which is under political siege, that it's a proxy of the U.S. and is going to initiate the war and so on. It's against the national interest. And the House Committee warned the members of the Communist Party to retract the words. And if they won't do that, they will sanction them in the future. So they didn't do anything at that time, but they warned them. Now, that's not exactly, let's say, the most proper conduct there was. However, that decision received 12 votes. 2 people were against that. And the members of Cherut, the Charedim, Poalei Agudat Israel, and Izhar Harari from the Progressive, didn't vote at all. So it wasn't that the coalition could do whatever it wants, or you can look at it and say, well, they have the majority, so people that are against it or didn't feel so comfortable with that decision could abstain. And the last thing in March 1957 is actually against Cherut, when the House Committee decided to sanction 5 members of Cherut and suspend one of them, Chaim Landau, for 3 sessions after they interfered with Ben Gurion's speech in the Knesset. So when we talk about institutionalization of parliaments, I used in my dissertation the model by Patterson and Copeland, Samuel Patterson and Gary Copeland. And in this paper, what I try to do is to take the same definitions and apply them on the ethics mechanism. So we have 4 criteria. We have autonomy, which means that the parliament is institutionalized when he has independent position, that it's not subjected to either rabbis, for example, or all kinds of bureaucrats. We have formality, which means that in order to reach formality, a parliament needs to have certain patterns, sort of rules of the game that are known and are clear about procedures, about norms on conduct, and so on. That's something that is evolved throughout time. The third criterion is uniformity, which is the actual generic pattern that exists in the world of parliaments. Let's say the authority to legislate bills, oversight the executive, and so on. So ethics mechanism or committee also applies to that. And complexity. In order to a parliament to be considered to be institutionalized, he has to have a high level of organizational complexity. Various actors, various bodies that deal with the connection of the public officials and the general public. And the involvement of the committees or the way they act is another expression of that complexity. Sorry. A slide, 30 minutes. Perfect. So to sum up, I talked about the establishment of the ethics mechanism and how it evolved gradually. I showed the connection between that mechanism and the parliamentary immunity that actually stabilized the mechanism. And I showed how the mechanism became a part of the Knesset long before the 1980s. That's it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shlomi. So I would like to ask members of the audience who are joining us online to please drop your questions, comments in the chat. And Corey and I are going to try to monitor the incoming questions and comments diligently. Let me just take a quick look around the in-person participants and see if there are any questions, comments in the room. Any questions, comments? No? Shlomi, then maybe before we look at what's coming in on the chat, let me...
but that's a lot of text I see here.
Well, you gave me a lot of food for thought.
Okay.
So a couple of questions that I would like to just clarify. The first has to do with, and just for detail, the case between Ben Gurion and Tubi.
Yeah.
Why was the prime minister so adamant? What did Tubi say? Was it something that he said about the IDF operations in the Arab villages, or was it the way he spoke? Was it his conduct, or was it the substance? Was he revealing military secrets? Why didn't the prime minister just let him have his way? Why? So what was at stake?
Okay.
And related to that, I would also like to ask whether you know if there was a way for a member of Knesset such as Tubi to appeal the decision. So
Yeah.
what was the process in the route? Was there a way to appeal?
Mhm.
And how did that work? And I have one other question, and then we'll see. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, so first of all, you have to remember that in the first years of the Knesset, most of the Arab members of the Knesset didn't speak Hebrew. So there was translation.
Yeah.
And the speaker of the Knesset, Shlomi Balaban, didn't speak Arabic. So he talked to Tubi the day before that session because he had a hunch that it's going to be volatile. And he told him, don't speak about that specific village because it's problematic. And I think it was Ara, I think. And now Tubi spoke in Arabic. Shpensak had no idea what he's saying, but suddenly he heard the word Ara.
The name of the village.
Yeah. And he said, did you just mention? We talked about it. And so, and everything blew up. That was the first thing. Second question, I didn't mention it, but yeah, there was a way to appeal on the ethics committee, or the ethics mechanism. And actually, Menachem Begin appealed in 1952,
Mhm.
and Tubi appealed. But when those two appealed, when you looked at the numbers, when you appealed, it goes to the plenum. And then it was opposition, a coalition against opposition. And the coalition had more votes. That was the end of it. So there was an option to appeal.
But the parties always, or the coalition and the opposition parties always voted consistently
In those specific
instances. Okay. My other question has to do with the last sort of the 4 points about institutionalization. And the first point you mentioned was about autonomy. And you mentioned, was that
right?
You mentioned particular scenarios where and actors whose influence might have jeopardized the immunity of the Knesset. You mentioned the bureaucracy, you mentioned the Rabbanut or rabbis. But I think there is another actor that I think, even in the stories that you mentioned, very consistently challenges the institutionalization of the Knesset, or maybe that's not how you see it. But what I see is at work is the strong, controlling power and influence of political parties.
Yeah.
And if political parties are strong, and at that time I think all the parties that you mentioned were very strong entities, then the Knesset is really, what's being institutionalized is really what the parties want, legislative institutionalization to be. So it's not really autonomous.
Right.
So what do you think about this? Maybe it's not valid.
I think you're correct, but when we talk about those specific fields, ethics, parliamentary immunity, and salary conditions, the dichotomy within the Knesset is not always according to coalition opposition. And sometimes people vote against what maybe their own personal interest. It's unbelievable, but it happened. And against what the party wanted. And a great example for that actually is the parliamentary immunity law, because Ben-Gurion was against it, and some of Mapai members were against it. Some of them were pro. So it's not that simple. I think it's got something to do more of the understanding or their attitude towards the role of a member of the Knesset.
That we see at work.
Yeah.
And so political parties in this case really didn't show the kind of cohesive.
Not always. It depends when. When we look on the 5 instances, when it comes to security issues, Mapai and Chut usually agreed. But when we talk about interference to when the 5 members of Chorut interfered with Ben-Gurion's speech, they didn't walk together, right? So it depends what is the issue. That's the thing. And I think it's more complex than, I know it was more complex than coalition and opposition.
But it never happened that members of the same political party would clash on an issue of ethics and then on immunity.
That's a good question. On immunity, the thing is with parliamentary immunity in the first decade is that the parliamentary immunity was lifted only when members of the Knesset that were the subject of the request to lift their immunity, it only happened when they agreed to do that. And the only, other than one case, there were always members of the coalition, not of the opposition. The other than, I think, one case, I'm not sure that at the same time this member of the Knesset was in the coalition or opposition, but other than that, parliamentary immunity was not lifted. Parliamentary immunity of members of the opposition was not lifted, including a case in which, at the end of October 1957, Tawfiq Toubi got into a fight with soldiers, and Chaim Cohen wanted to lift his immunity, and that didn't happen.
Interesting. The same Chaim Cohen.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
That did happen.
Shlomi, you started your presentation with references to the physical space,
right,
of the building of the first Knesset.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, of course, where the processes that you described became institutionalized. But then the Knesset moves.
Right.
The physical landscape changes.
Right.
With that move, does the behavior of Knesset members change? And what gets institutionalized here in downtown Jerusalem, does that continue?
It evolved. It evolved. It changed. It changed as did Israel. When you look on the decades of the 1960s, you start to realize that the concept of ethics is much more like we perceive it today. Because we have to remember that until the beginning of the 90s, members of the Knesset were able to work in another position and to get salaries. So they could be members of the Histadrut, they could be mayors, they could have a law practice, and so on. And so you could
have professional politicians. They didn't have to be.
Right. And that was especially interesting in case of lawyers, because when you look at the, let's say, groups, if you want to look at you can look at it and say, well, in the first decade of the Knesset, something like 25-30% of members of the Knesset were members of the kibbutzim. Okay? So it has significance.
Yeah.
And it probably influenced the Knesset in more ways than we can imagine right now. But when you look through the 60s, you realize, wait a minute, 4 of them are lawyers. So they can be, in the morning, they can be members of the Knesset. And afternoon, they are lawyers of like a big company. And again, meet the Minister of Finance, but not sit next to him. They sit next to him, actually, but this time to make other kind of business.
Right.
So that also changed, that evolved, and that is the reason in 1969 there was a committee that dealt with the problem of members of the Knesset being lawyers that represent governmental companies. That is like the next phase that evolved into the beginning of the 1980s. And the ethics committee And that also changed at the beginning of the 90s when they changed the law about the salaries of members of the Knesset and so on. They were not allowed to practice anything else. So it was an evolvement, like Israeli society evolved.
Yeah. My last question, Shlomi, is about bringing this up to date. Of course, the whole question of immunity was very much in Israeli public discourse, has been, and it is perhaps when the war is over and when normalcy, normal political life takes shape again, depending on who will be the Rosh Hashanah and what the shape of the government will be, it probably is going to come back again, and people will again talk about issues relating to the immunity of the prime minister and in general immunity of members of parliament. So what does this help us? What does the historical research and the findings and the insights that you have gained, how does it help a scholar like you make sense of what goes on today with respect to immunity in particular? Is the state of affairs more desirable, what it's like today, or was it better back in the formative years of Israel? Or how have you, as a scholar and concerned Israeli citizen, what have you learned from this research that might help you understand some of these questions in our lifetime?
So I'm going to tell you how I started this research. I started this research, or began thinking about it, when I studied for the Israeli bar exams, and there was a retirement speech by Chaim Ramon, and he talked about the good old days, but in a cynical way. He told them, "You think that used to be better? In the old days, they used to change their own pension, and people came here, they were like voting machines. Nobody knew what they were voting about. And people would fly for months and nobody would care about it, and so on." And that made me think, really, that was the case? And then I got into it. So, the reality was much more complicated than that. Actually, members of the Knesset, I'm trying to be polite, made really bad money until the 1990s. So when you look at the Knesset, not from a political angle, not from the fraction of the party, you realize that throughout the first 40 years, most of the years, about a third of the Knesset, across the board, lived only on their salary from the Knesset. And 2/3 had stuff going on. And that's across the board. So members of Mapai, for example, were in the Istadrut or mayors and so on. Members of Chirut or the General Zionists and all kind of the bourgeois, let's say, they had their law offices and so on. So when those young people that were young, let's say, in the beginning in 1948 and the 50s and 60s, when they got into their pension years, their retirement, they had like really bad condition to live on. And other than that, in those days, if you were a member of the Knesset and you left the Knesset for whatever reason, people usually thought that it's not dignified. So they
be a Knesset member.
No, afterwards to get, you want to leave. You are a member of the Knesset. You want to walk here. Come on. Today, I mean, the moment they go out, they find a lobby company or whatever, or a lawyer that's interesting to be partners with them, and so on. It's a total different reality. As for the immunity itself, First of all, if you read the law of parliamentary immunity in Israel, it's really strange. In a comparative perspective, it's really strange. There are all kinds of stuff that are in there that do not appear in other countries, and they were told by the Ministry of Justice that all, things like phones and buses and the passports and so on,
Right.
they are in the law, in the language of the law, which doesn't really exist somewhere elsewhere.
What is it about the passports and the phones?
They in an era in which people didn't have a phone in their home,
Right.
they received a phone.
Oh, as a gift.
It's it's a privilege,
It's a privilege.
because you're a member of the Knesset,
Um,
and you could talk
Right.
free and so on.
right, right.
So, and drive buses. I mean, we're talking about a country that I don't remember exactly the amount of automobiles at that time, but was not
Right.
a lot. And the laissez-passer and all kinds of stuff. I mean, who flew away? Who flew out of Israel? At that time, you were not allowed to leave Israel. And the currency and all kinds of stuff that, so it was really different. And as for immunity, by the way, we see all kind of cases right now that are being, they should get to the House committee pretty soon, like Ofer Kassif, for example. I think it's really interesting to compare between Tawfiq Toubi and Ofer Kassif.
Can you just elaborate a little bit about that case in particular? Because that resonates very nicely with the 2B.
So
It's a very nice comparison
the
between-
29th of October 1957 was really historical day, but again, like Begin and the Adam Maimon and Esther Hazel, no, there was something bigger that happened that day, and that's why people don't remember what happened with Toubi. And on the 29th of October 1957, Duek threw a grenade into the Knesset, and Ben Gurion was injured, Golda was injured, and so on. So it didn't get a lot of attention. The thing is, I found the letters from Chaim Cohen, the Attorney General, to the House Committee, and I saw all kinds of protocols that dealt with it, but I didn't see ethics mechanism or House Committee that actually dealt with the Toubi's case. That's really interesting. When you look, there's a book that it's made up. I think it was written by someone that worked in the Knesset archives, and he lists the different cases, parliamentary immunity, and he listed Tawfiq Toubi's case, and then there is a blank. Nobody knows what happened to that. So we'll see. We'll see what will happen.
Kassif is a much more recent.
And it's much less violent than what happened. They didn't go into specifics, but there was. That's again, 29th of October was the 1957, the day that we threw a grenade. It was also the 1 year commemoration of Kfar Kasem, and that's why Toubi wanted to get to Kfar Kasem and was not allowed because his parliamentary immunity did not existed in Mimshal Tzvei, in the way where the army controlled.
Military.
Yeah, the military.
Very interesting. So there's always a broader political context
Exactly.
within which these institutional processes.
And that's why I think that when we look at the Knesset, especially in those years, of course, there's a significance to the party and the fractions and everything else. But I think that what I've tried to do in my dissertation is to take a different look on it and see the variations and see that the dichotomy is not specifically, especially not when it comes to immunity, parliamentary immunity, ethics, and work conditions. It's not always about the party.
Right. That's important. Thank you very much. Let's see if there are any questions, comments in the chat. No? Let me take a look in the room. Any questions, comments? No? In that case, Shlomi, I would like to thank you ever so much for joining us here in Montreal, sharing your research results and insights with us. And we certainly look forward to hearing more from you. We look forward to welcoming you back, maybe as your research in Ottawa progresses. So you're always a friend, and you always have a home here at the Azrieli Institute. So please do come back. And ladies and gentlemen, I would like to draw your attention to an important announcement that our spring semester series of events is not over yet. A week from yesterday, actually. So on April 8th, we will be welcoming another visiting speaker from Israel, Dr. Osnat Akirov, also a specialist of Israeli parliamentary politics. She will be with us for a couple of days. Her first presentation will be a book launch, actually. She will be launching her new book that is just hot off the press, that looks at the politics of the parliamentary representation of Arab and Palestinian Knesset members in the Jewish state. And on the 10th of April, she will be speaking about the political economy of the Galilee region. Dr. Akirov was instrumental in developing the Galilee Index that measures the social, political, economic advancement of her home region. So we very much look forward to welcoming you back, either online or in person, depending on your circumstances. So please join me in physical and a virtual round of applause as we say thank you to Dr. Balaban for being with us today and telling us about the politics of parliamentary institutionalization.
Thank you, Chava.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.